The baby stopped crying at 4:17 in the morning, not because she had fallen asleep, not because her mother's arms had finally warmed her enough to bring comfort. She stopped crying because her body had surrendered the last of its heat to a floor that had been stealing it all night. A floor built the way every floor in the valley had been built, flat on the frozen ground, where the earth drank warmth from the living the way a river drinks snowmelt, constantly, invisibly, without mercy. Her mother kept holding her for 3 more hours, rocking a body that had already gone still, whispering promises into ears that could no longer hear them. 4 months earlier, the laughter had started before the first post hole was even dug. But to understand why that laughter would eventually turn to silence, and then to shame, and then to something no one in Harrow Creek had ever expected to feel toward two orphan boys with nothing but a dead woman's notebook, you have to go back to a summer morning in Milwaukee when everything changed because of an envelope that smelled like pine needles and old paper. Leander Hargrove was 18 years old on the morning he was told to leave. The headmaster of the Brewer Hill Home for Dependent Children did not look up from his desk when he delivered the news, did not offer a handshake or a word of encouragement or even the basic courtesy of eye contact. He simply read aloud from a form that informed Leander his residency had been terminated, effective immediately upon reaching the age of majority. The institution thanked him for his compliance during his years of care. A canvas bag containing his possessions waited by the front door. Leander had expected this. He had been expecting it for 2 years, marking the days on the wall beside his bed with a nail he had stolen from the carpentry shop, not counting down to freedom, but counting down to terror, because leaving meant leaving alone, and leaving alone meant leaving Finn behind. Phineas Hargrove was 11, small for his age, quiet in the way that children become quiet when they learn early that attention from adults rarely brings anything good. He had his mother's eyes, the pale gray blue that Leander remembered from before, from the time when there had been a before, when their mother's cough was just a cough and their father's drinking was just drinking and the floor of their cabin in Portage County was just a floor, not the cold stone altar where everything ended. The headmaster informed Leander that Phineas could not remain at Brewer Hill without a legal guardian or sponsor. Since no sponsor had presented themselves in the 6 years since the boy's arrival, and since the institution could not maintain responsibility for a minor with no benefactor, Phineas would be transferred to the county poorhouse in Waukesha, where children without prospects were housed until arrangements could be made. Arrangements. The word covered everything from adoption to indentured apprenticeship to simply being forgotten in a system that had too many children and too few people who cared about any of them. Leander looked at Finn, who stood in the hallway holding a book that had belonged to their mother, a book of Norwegian folk tales with illustrations of trolls and forests and a witch's hut that stood on chicken legs, walking through the woods on its own. Finn's knuckles were white around the spine. "We stay together," Leander said. It was not a request. The headmaster looked up for the first time. "That is not within my authority to arrange." Leander took Finn's hand, picked up both their bags, and walked out of the Brewer Hill Home for Dependent Children into a July morning that offered nothing except sunlight and the complete absence of any plan whatsoever. They walked south along the Lakeshore Road because south was a direction and walking was better than standing still. Leander had $4 in coins he had saved from odd jobs at the institution. Finn had the folktale book and a pencil he used to draw on the margins, filling every blank space with sketches of buildings and bridges and strange structures that existed only in his imagination. They slept in barns when farmers would allow it and beneath wagons when they would not. They ate when Leander could find work splitting wood or hauling freight or mucking stalls, and they went hungry when he could not, which was often. Finn never complained. He had learned before the age of 5 that complaining changed nothing, that the world was a place where things were taken from you and you either survived the taking or you did not. It was Finn who found the dog. 3 weeks into their wandering, camped behind a feed store in the town of Oconomowoc, Finn heard scratching beneath the loading dock and crawled underneath to investigate. He emerged with a hound mix so thin that every rib showed through its dull copper-colored coat, so weak it could barely stand, so frightened of human hands that it trembled when Finn touched it. Finn broke their last half loaf of bread and gave the larger piece to the dog. Leander watched this and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They had no food, and Finn had given what remained to an animal that might not survive the night. It was exactly the kind of thing their mother would have done. The dog survived the night, and the next night, and the mouse. Finn named him Copper for the color of his coat when it caught the light, and from that point forward, the boy and the boy were inseparable, completely and without reservation, because neither had anything left to protect except each other. It was on their 23rd day of wandering, in a town whose name Leander had not bothered to learn, that the lawyer found them. He was a small man in a black coat too heavy for summer, carrying a leather case that he held with both hands, as if it contained something more valuable than paper. He had been looking for them for 2 weeks, he said, had tracked them from Brewer Hill through a chain of farmers and shopkeepers who remembered 2 boys and a skinny dog traveling south with no apparent destination. He represented the estate of Astrid Hargrove, née Solvang, of Dane County, Wisconsin, their maternal grandmother. She had died on June the 14th, 17 days before Leander turned 18. She had left a will. Leander stared at the lawyer and felt something shift inside his chest, some tectonic movement of hope and confusion and a grief he had not known he carried for a woman he barely remembered. He had met his grandmother perhaps 3 times. She had spoken English with an accent that turned every word into something harder and more deliberate, and she had smelled like wood smoke and pine sap. And the last time he saw her, she had pressed her hand against his cheek and said something in Norwegian that he could not understand but had never forgotten because of the way her eyes looked when she said it. The will was simple. Astrid Hargrove left her 40-acre claim in Harrow Creek Valley to her grandsons Leander and Phineas Hargrove, jointly and without condition, along with all structures, improvements, tools, and personal effects contained therein. The personal effects included a leather-bound notebook, 87 pages long, written in a mixture of English and Norwegian in handwriting so precise it looked like engraving. Every page contained drawings, measurements, calculations, and instructions for building a structure that the lawyer had looked at and described as unusual. Leander opened the notebook to the first page, where his grandmother had written in letters large enough to serve as a title. "The ground is hungry. It ate your mother. Don't let it eat you." Finn leaned against Leander's arm and stared at the words. Copper pressed his nose against Finn's knee. "What does she mean, the ground is hungry?" Finn asked. Leander turned the page and found a drawing of a cabin standing on 8 thick posts raised 4 feet above the earth, with empty space beneath the floor, and careful annotations in his grandmother's precise hand describing measurements, angles, and materials. Beside the drawing, she had written a single Norwegian word, stabber, and beneath it, in English, the hut on legs. "She means don't build on the ground," Leander said. "She means build above it." Harrow Creek Valley sat in Dane County like a bowl carved by glaciers 10,000 years before anyone thought to farm it. The soil was rich, the timber abundant. The creek that gave the valley its name ran clear and cold through limestone bedrock. 37 families had settled there between 1840 and 1847, drawn by land prices that the territorial government kept low to attract exactly the kind of hardworking, God-fearing people who would turn wilderness into tax-paying civilization. Jedediah Caldwell had been the first to claim land in the valley, arriving in 1839 with capital, connections, and the particular confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong about anything important. He owned 600 acres of the best bottomland, ran 40 head of cattle, and employed 3 hired men year-round. He served as the unofficial authority on all matters relating to property, propriety, and the proper way things ought to be done in a community that he considered, not without justification, to be largely his creation. He was waiting on the trail when Leander and Finn arrived in August, as if the land itself had informed him that someone was coming to claim the one piece of the valley he did not own. Astrid Hargrove's 40 acres sat on elevated ground at the valley's western edge, bordered by old-growth forest on 3 sides and Josiah Pratt's cornfield on the 4th. It was good land, well-drained, with southern exposure and a spring that ran year-round. Caldwell had offered to buy it from Astrid 7 times over 15 years. She had refused 7 times, each refusal delivered with a stubbornness forged in a country where rock and ice taught you never to surrender ground you had gained. Caldwell studied the 2 boys and their thin dog from the back of a horse that cost more than everything they owned combined. He saw ragged clothes, empty hands, youth that bordered on childhood. He saw opportunity dressed as charity. Your grandmother was a stubborn old woman, he said. Spent 30 years on that land and never did make anything of it. Lived alone in a cabin that wasn't fit for livestock. He paused to let the assessment settle. I'll give you $40 for the claim. Cash money. That's $1 an acre for land that isn't worth half that to anyone but me, seeing as it borders my property. Leander looked at Caldwell for a long time. $40 was more money than he had ever possessed. It was enough to rent a room in Milwaukee for months, enough to buy food and clothes and perhaps apprentice Finn to a tradesman who would teach him something useful. No, Leander said. Caldwell's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way a door closes without making a sound. Son, I'm offering you charity and you're too young to recognize it. 2 orphan boys with no tools, no experience, and no friends in this valley. Winter comes in 4 months. You can't build a cabin, clear land, and put up enough wood to survive before the snow falls. Sell to me, take the money, and go somewhere that makes sense for boys your age. It's our land, Leander said. Our grandmother left it to us. We're keeping it. Caldwell looked at Finn, who stood behind his brother with copper pressed against his legs. I give them till first frost, Caldwell said to no one in particular, turning his horse back toward the trail. 2 orphan boys playing house on stilts. He had seen the notebook in Leander's hand, had seen the drawings. The news would be all over the valley by nightfall. The first week on the land was spent clearing brush and understanding what their grandmother had left them. The cabin where Astrid had lived her last years was barely standing, a one-room structure with a saw roof and a floor of packed earth that Leander recognized immediately as exactly what the notebook warned against. The floor was stained with the mineral residue of decades of ground moisture wicking upward through the soil. In the corners where the earth met the log walls, white frost crystals lingered even in August, remnants of the previous winter's assault that the summer sun had not fully erased. She lived on this floor, Leander said to Finn, running his hand across the cold-stained earth. All those years she knew the ground was stealing her heat, and she couldn't do anything about it. Why not? Finn asked. Leander turned to a page near the back of the notebook where Astrid had written in a hand less steady than the rest, as if the words had cost her something to put down. Your grandfather tore down my stabber. He said Norwegian ways had no place in America. I never built another. I was afraid. Don't be afraid like me. Build it. Finish it. Finn read the words twice, then looked at the ruined cabin where their grandmother had spent 30 years sleeping on a floor that ate her warmth. He was 11 years old, and he understood something that many adults never grasp, that fear could kill you just as certainly as cold, just more slowly and with more regret. The next morning, Leander began digging the first post hole. The notebook specified 8 holes arranged in a rectangle, 20 feet by 16 feet. Each hole 4 feet deep and 2 feet wide, positioned to support timber posts that would raise the cabin floor 4 feet above the ground. The grandmother's drawings showed the engineering clearly. Posts buried 4 feet for stability, rising 4 feet above grade, creating an air gap between the living space and the frozen earth that would come with winter. In Norway, she had written, we call this staber. The old houses stood on legs of stone or timber. The ground freezes, but the floor does not touch the ground. Air between floor and earth. Air does not steal heat. Air does not freeze solid. The ground can be as hungry as it wants. It cannot reach what it cannot touch. Leander dug. Finn carried away the excavated earth in a bucket that weighed nearly as much as he did. Copper sat at the edge of the worksite, ears alert, watching the trail for anyone who might approach. People approached often. Harlan Colton came on the 3rd day. He was the valley's only trained carpenter, a man of 52 who had built 40 cabins across Dane County and considered himself, with considerable justification, the final authority on what constituted proper construction. He stood at the edge of Leander's clearing with his arms folded across his chest and watched the boy dig for 20 minutes before speaking. I've built 40 cabins, he said. Not one of them needed to stand on legs. You're wasting time you don't have, son. Winter doesn't wait for foolish ideas to fail. It just comes. Leander kept digging. I offered to help you build a proper cabin. I offered twice. You shook your head both times. So I came to see what you're doing instead, And what I see makes no sense. Holes for a platform? You're building a watchtower, not a home. It's a home, Leander said without looking up, just not on the ground. Colton shook his head the way experienced men do when they see a mistake coming and know they cannot stop it. Every cabin in this valley sits on the ground or on a stone foundation. That's how it's done. That's how it's always been done. I won't put my name on whatever this is. He left. And he told everyone at Opal Prewitt's general store what he had seen. The story spread through Harrow Creek Valley with the efficiency that only small-town gossip can achieve, losing nothing in accuracy and gaining everything in ridicule. The orphan boys are building their cabin on stilts. Opal Pruitt reported to every customer who entered the store, her voice carrying the mix of pity and entertainment that was her unique gift, like a chicken coop, only bigger. Poor motherless things. Someone should stop them before they hurt themselves. Derek Skaggs, 22 years old and possessed of the confidence that comes from never having been tested by anything genuinely difficult, rode out to see for himself and came back with a pronouncement that he delivered to the crowd at the general store with theatrical certainty. I'll bet my best saddle that shack falls before Christmas. No foundation, just poles in the ground. First good wind will knock it flat and those boys with it. Reverend Amos Whitfield had addressed the matter from the pulpit the following Sunday, not by name but with unmistakable reference. God gave us flat ground to build upon, he said, his voice carrying the resonant authority of a man who believed he spoke for the Almighty on matters of architecture as well as salvation. Raising a house on stilts is raising yourself above his plan. Pride comes before a fall, and the higher you build your pride, the harder that fall will be. The name came from Caldwell himself, delivered at the general store with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to having his assessments accepted as fact. The orphan stilts, he called it, has a nice ring to it, like orphan's folly or fool's errand. Same meaning, really. The name stuck. For weeks afterward, the construction site was referred to as the Orphan Stilts, and the boys who labored there from dawn to dark were the Stilt Boys, terms that carried mockery in every syllable. If you had asked anyone in Harrow Creek Valley that autumn whether those two brothers would make it through winter, the answer would have been unanimous. Not a chance. But I want to ask you something before we go on. If you were 18 years old, alone in the world except for your little brother and Iba, with nothing but a dead woman's notebook and 40 acres of land that everyone said was worthless, would you have kept digging? Or would you have taken Caldwell's $40 and walked away? Think about that as this story continues. Gustav Lindmark came on a Tuesday evening in September when the shadows were long and the air carried the first faint suggestion of the cold that was coming. He was the valley's blacksmith, a Swede who had arrived 3 years earlier and maintained the careful neutrality of a man who depended on everyone's business and could afford no one's enmity. He spoke little, worked hard, and kept his opinions about other people's construction projects entirely to himself. He stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, watching Leander shape a post with an adze, stripping bark in long curls that fell around his feet like wood shavings from a lathe. Finn sat nearby reading the notebook aloud, translating their grandmother's instructions into the sequence of actions his brother performed. Lindmark walked closer. He looked at the post holes, at the charred ends of the posts Leander had already prepared, at the precise spacing that matched the diagram in the notebook. His expression changed in a way that Leander noticed, because it was different from every other expression he had seen since arriving in the valley. Not mockery, not pity. Recognition. Stabber, Lindmark said quietly. My grandmother had one in Dalarna. Her storeroom stood on 6 stone legs. The cheese never froze, even in the worst winters. Leander stopped working. It was the first time anyone had spoken the word he had read in his grandmother's notebook. The first time anyone had looked at what he was building and seen something other than foolishness. Lindmark looked over his shoulder toward the trail, checking whether anyone had followed him or could see him standing here. The gesture told Leander everything about the social cost of association. I cannot help you openly, Lindmark said. Caldwell brings me all his ironwork. Colton sends me hinge orders from every cabin he builds. If I stand with you against them, I lose everything. He set something on the ground beside Leander's work area, a bundle wrapped in burlap that clinked softly with the sound of metal on metal. Hinges, Lindmark said, forged from horseshoe iron, and a draw knife that is better than the one you are using." He paused. "Your grandmother knew what she was building. Don't let them stop you." He left the way he had come, quickly and without looking back, and Leander unwrapped the bundle to find 4 iron hinges of extraordinary craftsmanship and a draw knife with an edge so fine it could shave wood like paper. Tools that would have cost money he did not have, given by a man who could not afford to be seen giving them. Finn scratched Copper behind the ears and looked at his brother. "He believes us." "One person," Leander said. "One person in this whole valley." "That's one more than yesterday," Finn replied. The post went in during the first week of October. 8 massive timbers, each 10 inches in diameter and 8 feet long, with 4 feet buried in the earth and 4 feet rising above. Leander had charred the buried portions over fire, following his grandmother's instructions precisely, a technique that created a carbon layer resistant to moisture and insects, the same technique that Scandinavian builders had used for centuries to preserve wood in wet soil. Setting the posts alone required engineering that none of the men who mocked him had bothered to observe. Leander built a tripod crane from 3 long poles, rigging ropes through a pulley block that Gustav Lindmark had quietly left beside the trail one evening without note or explanation. The system allowed a single person to raise each massive timber and lower it into its hole with the precision that the notebook demanded. It was during the 7th post that everything nearly ended. The rope slipped. Not much, perhaps 6 inches of give where the fibers had abraded against the pulley block. But 6 inches was enough. The post tilted, the balance shifted, and 800 pounds of timber swung sideways with the slow, terrible momentum of something too heavy to stop. Leander threw himself backward. The post crashed across the edge of the hole, missing his legs by a distance he would later measure at 11 inches. Finn screamed from across the clearing. Copper barked, frantic, circling the fallen post as if trying to herd it back into submission. Caldwell was on the trail. He had been riding past, or perhaps he had been watching, which amounted to the same thing. He sat on his horse and looked at the fallen post and the boy lying in the dirt and the child crying at the edge of the clearing, and delivered his assessment with the calm certainty of a man watching prophecy fulfill itself. "God himself is telling you to stop, boy. Sell me the land before that thing kills you. Next time it won't miss." He rode on without waiting for an answer. That night, Leander sat beside the fire outside the ruined cabin where they were still sleeping, his hands shaking with a tremor that had nothing to do with cold. The post lay where it had fallen, a monument to the possibility that everyone was right, that he was an 18-year-old orphan building something beyond his ability, that the notebook was the delusion of a lonely old woman, that Caldwell's $40 in a warm room in Milwaukee made more sense than dying under a falling timber in a valley where no one wanted them. Finn sat beside him, Copper lay between them, his head on Finn's lap, his copper-colored ears twitching at sounds in the darkness. Without speaking, Finn opened the notebook to the last page. He had read the entire book multiple times by now, had memorized passages, had traced the drawings with his finger until he could reproduce them from memory. But the last page was different. It was not instructions or measurements, it was a letter. Finn read it aloud in the firelight. "My dear grandchildren, if you are reading this, I am gone and you are standing on my land. I hope you are standing, not kneeling. Your grandfather was a proud man who believed that his way was the only way. When I built my stabber, my storehouse on legs the way my mother taught me in Norway, he tore it down. He said it was foreign, he said it was ugly. He said no wife of his would build pagan structures on American soil. I never built another, not because he was right, because I was afraid. I spent 30 years sleeping on a frozen floor because I was too afraid to build the floor I knew was better. Your mother slept on that same floor. She died on it. I will die on it too, and that is the punishment I have earned for my cowardice. You are young, you have nothing, and that is why you might succeed where I failed. People with nothing to lose are the only people brave enough to build something new. Build my stabber. Finish what I was too afraid to finish. And when the ground comes hungry in winter, you will be above it, warm, alive, and free. Your loving grandmother, Astrid." The fire crackled. An owl called from the dark timber. Copper lifted his head and licked Finn's hand. Leander stood up. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, though the firelight was kind enough not to reveal what he was wiping away. "First thing tomorrow," he said, "we fix that post." The platform went up in November, and with it, the walls. Leander worked 16-hour days, racing a season that showed no mercy to builders who fell behind schedule. Finn served as architect's assistant, reading measurements from the notebook, holding levels, fetching tools, and maintaining a supply of hot water and food that Willa Whitmore had begun leaving at the edge of the clearing each morning. Willa was 22, a widow since the previous spring when her husband Ephraim had been killed by a falling tree during a logging accident that had also claimed his brother. She lived with her sister Cordelia and brother-in-law Harlan Colton, a young woman with no husband, no children, and no clear path forward in a community that measured women by their attachments to living men. She never spoke to Leander directly during those weeks of secret provisioning. She simply appeared before dawn, left a basket containing bread, dried meat, sometimes a jar of preserves or a bottle of milk, and disappeared before the boys woke. It was Copper who first alerted them to the gifts, sniffing the basket on the porch of the old cabin and wagging his tail with the enthusiasm of a dog who understood that baskets meant food and food meant survival. Leander knew who was leaving them. He had seen her footprints in the frost one morning, small boots heading back toward the Colton property. He left a carved wooden spoon beside the empty basket one evening, the only thing he could offer in return. The spoon was gone the next morning, and the basket contained an extra loaf. Finn got sick in mid-November, a chest cold that turned into a rattling cough that kept him awake through the nights, his small body shaking on the straw mattress in the old cabin while Copper pressed against him and Leander heated stones to place around his brother's bed. The cold was not dangerous yet, not the killing cold that was coming, but it was cold enough to slow a sick child's recovery and cold enough to remind Leander that everything he was building was not academic. It was not architectural theory or ancestral pride or even defiance of the people who mock them. It was survival, his brother's survival. And if he did not finish the cabin before real winter arrived, the floor of the old cabin, the same frozen floor where their grandmother had slept and their mother had died, would have a chance to claim another Hargrove. He worked faster. He worked in rain that turned the clearing to mud. He worked in the first frost that hardened the ground and made every swing of the hammer ring like a bell. He worked with bleeding hands and a back that seized with pain every morning and relaxed only when the day's labor warmed the muscles into grudging cooperation. Old Ezra Munslow visited once during this period, 78 years old, the oldest person in Harrow Creek Valley, a man who had survived the winter of 1820 in a dugout shelter in Ohio, and who carried the memory of genuine cold in his bones the way some men carry shrapnel. He walked slowly around the elevated platform, studying the construction with eyes that had seen more building methods than anyone else in the valley could claim. "I don't know if it'll work, son," he said finally, "but I've seen cold kill men in houses they thought were strong. Every cabin in this valley sits on the ground, and every winter the ground tries to eat them. At least you're trying something different." It was not an endorsement. It was something better. It was the acknowledgement of a man who had lived long enough to know that the way things had always been done was not always the way things should be done. The roof went on December 3rd. Leander nailed the last shingle in place as snow fell around him, and the temperature dropped towards single digits. The cabin was complete. Walls chinked tight with moss and clay. A stone chimney rising from the center, built from river rocks that Leander had carried up the ladder one by one. A solid door that swung on the iron hinges Gustav Lindmark had forged, and all of it standing 4 feet above the frozen ground on 8 charred posts that showed no sign of settling or shifting or doing any of the catastrophic things that Harlan Colton had predicted. The crawl space beneath the floor had been packed with straw and dried grass, following the notebook's specifications exactly, creating a buffer zone of trapped air and insulating material between the living space and the earth below. Leander carried Finn up the ladder that evening. The boy was recovering from his illness, but still weak, still coughing, still small enough that Leander could lift him with one arm while climbing with the other. Copper scrambled up the ladder behind them with the determined agility of a dog who had no intention of being left below while his people were above. Leander built the first fire in the fireplace. The cabin warmed quickly, more quickly than the old cabin had ever warmed with twice the fuel. Heat rose and filled the space and stayed there, held by walls and roof and a floor that did not bleed warmth into the frozen ground below. The air gap worked exactly as the notebook described. The floor was cold, but not freezing. The cabin maintained warmth with a modest fire that would have been insufficient in any ground-level structure in the valley. Finn lay on the sleeping platform Leander had built against the warmest wall, copper curled at his feet. He pressed his hand flat against the floor and held it there. Leander, the floor isn't cold. I know, Finn. That's the whole point. Finn was quiet for a moment, his hand still on the floor, feeling the absence of the killing chill that had been beneath every floor he had ever known. Grandmother knew, he said softly. She always knew. And she couldn't build it for herself. We built it for her, Leander said. And we built it for us. And if winter does what I think it's going to do, we built it for everyone. The cabin was finished. The skeptics were still laughing. But winter had not truly arrived yet. And when it did, it would test everything, the cabin, the brothers, and every single person who had mocked them. Some of you watching right now have felt cold so deep it scared you. Some of you know what it's like to hear your children cry from cold you can't fix. Hold on to that feeling, because what happened next in Harrow Creek Valley was worse than anything those families had imagined. The Great Cold came on January 7th, 1848. It did not arrive gradually, the way most winter weather systems approach, building over days through dropping temperatures and increasing cloud cover, in the slow accumulation of signs that experienced settlers learned to read. It came like an ambush, like something that had been waiting in the Canadian wilderness for precisely the right moment to descend. At noon on January 7th, the temperature in Harrow Creek Valley was 20 degrees above zero. Cold but manageable. Routine. The kind of cold that settlers dressed for and worked in and complained about over dinner without any real concern. By 6 in the evening, it was zero. By midnight, it was 20 below. By dawn on January 8th, the mercury in the thermometer hanging outside Opal Prewitt's general store had contracted to the bottom of its tube and refused to rise. The reading, verified later by instruments at the Territorial Weather Station in Madison, was 41 degrees below zero, the coldest temperature ever recorded in Wisconsin Territory, a number that most people in the valley had never experienced and could not have imagined. The world outside became something alien, something hostile to human life in a way that went beyond discomfort into genuine lethality. The air itself became a weapon. Men who stepped outside felt their nostrils freeze shut with their first breath, felt the moisture on their eyeballs begin to crystallize if they did not blink constantly. Exposed skin could suffer frostbite in 3 minutes. In 3 minutes, the cold could take your fingers, your nose, your ears, and it could take them permanently. But the cold outside was not what killed people. The cold that killed came from below. In Jedediah Caldwell's cabin, the finest home in the valley, built with the best materials and the most experienced labor money could hire, the packed earth floor froze solid sometime in the early hours of January 8th. The cold did not seep through the floor. It radiated. It pulsed upward through the boards Caldwell had laid over the earth, conducting heat away from the living space above with the relentless efficiency of a natural law that no amount of money or pride could override. Caldwell threw wood on the fire, more wood, then more. The fire roared, the chimney drew flames 3 feet high, and still the floor stayed cold. His daughter Emmeline, 5 years old, woke crying, her feet numb beneath 2 blankets, her small body shivering with a violence that frightened her parents more than the cold itself. Caldwell burned through half his woodpile in a single night. A supply that should have lasted 2 weeks consumed in hours by a fire that was not heating his home so much as fighting a losing battle against the frozen ground beneath it. Harlan Colton fared only slightly better. His cabin had a proper stone foundation, the best construction in the valley by his own professional assessment, but stone conducted cold almost as efficiently as frozen earth. Frost formed on his interior floor by the second night. His wife Cordelia heated stones in the fireplace and wrapped them in cloth and placed them under the children's beds, a strategy that required constant reheating and still could not overcome the fundamental physics of a floor in contact with ground that had frozen to a depth of 4 feet. Josiah Pratt's cabin, built in a low area near the creek where the soil retained more moisture than the higher ground, suffered the worst structural damage. The water in the soil beneath his floor froze and expanded with a force that buckled the floorboards upward in waves, opening gaps in the walls where the frame had shifted. Cold air poured through the gaps with a sound like breathing, as if the winter itself were exhaling into the cabin. By the second day, Pratt loaded his wife and 3 children onto a sled and dragged them through the killing cold to the Colton cabin, arriving with frostbitten hands and a family that was alive only because the distance between the 2 homes was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Derek Skaggs lost 2 fingers on January 9th. He had gone to his woodpile 50 feet from his door without gloves because the trip should have taken 30 seconds. The cold took his fingers in the time it took to load an armful of split oak. 2 fingers that would never feel anything again. That was what 50 feet cost in 41 below. The first death came that same day. Old Ezekiel Tanner, a widower who lived alone at the eastern edge of the settlement. His nearest neighbor found him frozen in his bed when the smoke stopped rising from his chimney. His woodpile was empty. His fire was ash. The cold had simply outlasted his fuel supply, and when the fire died, the frozen ground beneath his floor had claimed the heat from his cabin and then from his body with the patience of something that had been hungry for a very long time. The second death was the one that broke the valley's heart. Sarah Hutchkins was 2 months old. Her mother Mary had done everything a mother could do. She had wrapped the baby in every blanket and cloth and piece of clothing in the cabin. She had held the infant against her bare skin for 11 hours straight, sharing her own body heat with a child too small to generate enough on its own. She had positioned herself directly beside the fire, as close as she could get without burning. It was not enough. The ground beneath their cabin floor was a thief that operated on a scale no mother's love could match. It stole heat from the floor, from the bed, from the blankets, from the air itself, and it stole it continuously, hour after hour, with no pause and no mercy and no possibility of negotiation. The fire fought the ground. The mother fought the cold. And the baby, who had done nothing to deserve any of this, who had committed no error of judgment or construction or pride, simply ran out of warmth. She stopped crying at 4:17 in the morning on January 10th. Mary Hutchkins continued rocking her for 3 hours, whispering into silence, holding a weight that did not change but somehow felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. The third death came on January 11th. Robert Clemens, 23 years old, a farmer whose wife was expecting their first child in March. He went to his barn to check on livestock that was dying in the cold. The barn was 30 feet from his cabin door. He made it to the barn. He did not make it back. His wife found him when the cold finally broke, lying in the snow 18 feet from his own front door, his hand outstretched toward a warmth he had almost reached. 3 people dead, dozens frostbitten. Every family in Harrow Creek Valley burning furniture, burning fence posts, burning anything that would catch fire, trying to survive a cold that attacked them through their own floors. And less than half a mile away, in a cabin that everyone had called the orphan Stilts, 2 boys and a copper-colored dog sat warm. If you're still here, I think you already know why. But what happened next is the part of this story that nobody expected, not even Leander. Leander Hargrove spent the great cold in something close to comfort. The elevated cabin performed exactly as his grandmother's notebook had predicted. The air gap beneath the floor prevented the frozen ground from stealing heat. The straw-packed crawl space created insulation that turned the killing earth below into a neutral presence rather than an active thief. The floor was cold, certainly, perhaps 40 degrees. Uncomfortable for bare feet, but the cabin's interior maintained a steady 55 degrees with a modest fire, warm enough to work, to cook, to sleep without fearing death. Finn read by firelight. Copper dozed on the sleeping platform. The small fire burned slowly through a woodpile that showed no sign of running short. But comfort and peace are not the same thing. Leander could see the smoke from the settlement's chimneys through the cabin window. Not the thin wisps of well-managed fires, but the desperate, boiling columns of people burning everything they owned to stay alive. Every chimney in the valley was screaming into the frozen sky, and every scream was a plea from families losing their war against the cold. He knew what was happening in those cabins. He had grown up in one. He had watched his mother die in one. He knew the exact sensation of a floor that steals your warmth while you sleep, The way your feet go numb first, and then your legs, and then the cold creeps up your body like water rising in a well, filling you with the chill that will eventually reach your heart. On the third night, he bundled himself in every piece of clothing he owned and descended the ladder into air so cold it felt solid. He carried blankets rolled under one arm and a determination that lasted approximately 200 yards before the cold defeated it. The wind cut through 4 layers of clothing as if they were made of paper. His face went numb in seconds. His fingers, despite heavy mittens, began to lose feeling before he had covered half the distance to the nearest cabin. Copper had followed him down the ladder and now pressed against his legs, whimpering, trying to herd him back toward safety, toward warmth, toward home. Leander made it 200 yards. Then his legs began to disobey his intentions, stumbling on ground he could not feel, moving with the uncoordinated weakness of muscles that were shutting down in the cold. He turned back. Copper guided him, pressing against his legs, steering him toward the faint glow of the cabin above. He barely made it. His fingers were white with the early stages of frostbite when he finally pulled himself up the ladder and stumbled through the door into warmth that felt like something he did not deserve. Finn was waiting, his face tight with a fear that 11-year-olds should not have to carry. "You can't save them if you're dead," Finn said, and the words carried a maturity that grief had given him years ahead of schedule. Leander sat by the fire, flexing his damaged fingers, feeling the pain of returning circulation, and fought the guilt that was worse than the cold. He had knowledge that could have saved them. His grandmother had left that knowledge in a notebook. He had built it into a cabin that anyone could have observed and questioned and learned from. But they had laughed instead of listened, mocked instead of learned, and now they were dying while he sat warm. It was Finn who thought of the signal. On the fourth morning, while Leander stared out the window at smoke columns that looked like distress flags, Finn climbed to the roof with a lantern and a piece of tin he had salvaged from their grandmother's old cabin. He angled the tin to catch the lantern light and directed it toward the settlement, flashing a pattern that anyone looking toward the western ridge would see. "What are you doing?" Leander called up. "Telling them we're here," Finn said. "Telling them they're somewhere warm." It was an 11-year-old's logic, simple and unashamed of its own hope. Leander doubted anyone in the settlement was looking toward the ridge. But he did not tell Finn to stop, because the boy needed to do something, needed to fight the helplessness with whatever tool his mind could invent. And perhaps on the fifth night, a young widow carrying a freezing child did see a faint light flickering on the ridge and followed it like a star. On the fifth night, someone came to them. Leander heard Copper before he heard anything else. The dog lifted his head from the sleeping platform, ears rigid, a low sound building in his throat that was not a growl but an alert, the sound he used when something approached the cabin from the trail. Then Leander heard it. Footsteps. Not the steady crunch of someone walking with purpose, but the stumbling, uneven sound of someone walking through cold that was trying to kill them. He opened the door and looked down from the elevated porch into darkness that was so cold it seemed to have substance, a physical weight pressing against everything it touched. A figure stood at the base of the ladder, clutching something against her chest. She was coated in frost, her shawl rigid with ice, her face so white that for a moment Leander thought she was already dead and had simply walked to his cabin by reflex before the cold finished its work. It was Willa Whitmore, and the thing she clutched was not a bundle of blankets. It was Emmett Pratt, 4 years old, the youngest of Josiah Pratt's children. The family had been sheltering at the Colton cabin since the second day of the cold, but the Colton cabin was failing too, its stone floor conducting winter into every corner, and the smallest and weakest were losing the battle first. Emmett had stopped shivering. Any parent, any grandmother, any person who has ever held a cold child knows what that means. A shivering child is fighting. A child who has stopped shivering has begun to surrender. Willa looked up at Leander with eyes that held nothing except a single desperate calculation. She had seen the light on the ridge. She had walked half a mile through killing cold on the chance that the stilt cabin she had been leaving food beside for months was as warm as a dead woman's notebook promised. If it was not warm, she and the child would both die here at the base of a ladder they did not have the strength to climb. Leander descended the ladder in his stockinged feet, the cold biting into his soles like teeth. He took the child from Willa's arms and felt how light the boy was, how still, how cold. He half-carried Willa to the ladder and pushed her upward while climbing behind her. One hand on the ladder, the other holding a 4-year-old, whose heartbeat he could not feel through the frozen layers of cloth. Inside, Finn was already moving. He pulled blankets from the sleeping platform. He stoked the fire until it blazed. Copper pressed himself against Willa's legs as she collapsed beside the hearth, shivering so violently her teeth sounded like stones clicking together. Leander unwrapped the frozen child and held him against his own chest, skin to skin, the way the notebook described for treating severe cold exposure. Finn heated stones and placed them around the boy. Copper lay along the child's legs, offering the steady warmth of a body that never wavered. For 20 minutes, Emmett did not move, did not shiver, did not make any sound at all. Leander held him and breathed slowly and tried not to think about what it would mean if the boy did not come back from whatever cold place his body had retreated to. Then a shiver, small, almost imperceptible, but real. The body's furnace reigniting from its last ember. More shivers followed, then movement, then a sound, a thin, high whimpering that was the most beautiful noise Leander had ever heard because it meant the child was alive and fighting again. Willa was staring at the cabin around her, at the walls, the fire, the warm air that pressed against her frozen skin like an embrace, at the floor beneath her, which was cold but not deadly, cool but not killing. "How is this possible?" she whispered. Her teeth were chattering so badly, the words came out fractured. "It's warm. How is it warm?" Leander pointed at the floor beneath them, then at the window that looked out over the crawl space below. 4 feet of empty space between this floor and the frozen earth. That's all. Just air. And air is the one thing the cold cannot turn into a weapon. Willa put her palm flat on the floor and held it there, feeling the absence of death. "My sister's cabin," she said. "The floor is like ice. The children are huddled in a corner, and the fire can't reach them because the ground takes everything first." "I know," Leander said. "My grandmother knew too. She wrote it all down, but no one listened." Willa looked at him across the firelit room, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with romance or attraction or any of the things that stories usually mean when they describe two people recognizing each other. It was simpler and more important than any of those things. It was the recognition of one survivor by another. The understanding that this young man, this orphan boy the whole valley had mocked, had known something that could have prevented everything that was happening outside and had been unable to make anyone hear it. Emmett Pratt fell asleep in Leander's arms at 3 in the morning, breathing steadily, his skin pink again, his small fingers wrapped around the ear of a copper-colored dog who had not moved from his side since the moment they had laid him by the fire. The great cold broke on January 14th. The temperature climbed from 40 below to 20 below to 0 over the course of 18 hours, each degree of warming feeling like a pardon from a death sentence. By the morning of the 15th, it was 5 above, a temperature that would have felt brutal a month ago and now felt like spring. Harrow Creek Valley emerged from the great cold the way survivors emerge from any catastrophe, slowly, blinking, counting losses that they had not yet fully comprehended. 3 dead, dozens frostbitten, wood piles depleted to nothing across the settlement, livestock frozen in barns, the church so cold that its windows had cracked from thermal stress, the stained glass fracturing along lines that looked like frozen tears. Willa had returned to the Colton cabin on the morning of the 14th, carrying Emmett Pratt warm and alive, and carrying something else, a story that she told to Cordelia first, and that Cordelia told to Harlan, and that spread through the sheltering families with the speed of desperate hope. The Stilt cabin is warm. Not hot. Warm, the floor doesn't freeze. They burned half the wood we burned and stayed twice as warm. The cabin sits above the ground on posts. The cold couldn't reach them. Harlan Colton was the first to ride out. He went on the morning of January 15th, his professional pride overridden by professional curiosity and something harder to name, a guilt that had been building since the great cold began. A voice that whispered things he did not want to hear about 40 cabins built on the ground and the people who had frozen in them. He followed the trail toward the Hargrove property expecting devastation, expecting some version of the suffering he had witnessed everywhere else, scaled down perhaps but still present, proof that the orphan Stilts were merely less terrible than conventional construction, not fundamentally different. What he found instead changed everything. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney in a thread so thin it barely marked the sky. Every other chimney in the valley had been screaming smoke for a week. This one whispered, and that whisper told Colton everything he needed to know before he even reached the ladder. The cabin stood intact on its 8 posts, snow drifted around the stilts but not touching the floor above. The crawl space beneath was packed with straw that had performed exactly as Astrid Hargrove's notebook specified, trapping air that insulated the floor from the frozen ground below. And sitting on the elevated porch, wrapped in a single wool coat, Leander Hargrove was drinking tea. Beside him, Finn was sketching in the margins of a book. At their feet, a copper-colored tea lay dozing in a patch of winter sunlight. Colton stopped his horse and stared for a long time. "You're alive," he said. The words carried the weight of a man whose entire understanding of his profession was collapsing in real time. "We're alive," Leander confirmed. "The tea is hot if you want some." Colton climbed the ladder on stiff legs and followed Leander through the door into a cabin that was warm. Not hot, not tropical, but genuinely, sustainably warm in a way that his own home had not achieved even with constant fire and stone-wrapped beds and every survival technique he knew. "How," he said, the single word carried a week of suffering. Leander opened his grandmother's notebook to the page with the primary diagram. He pointed to the drawing, then to the floor beneath their feet, then to the crawl space visible through the window. The ground freezes. Frozen ground steals heat from anything touching it. 15 BTU per square foot per hour at least, maybe more in conditions like this week. Every cabin in this valley sits on the ground. Every cabin in this valley is trying to heat the earth itself, and the earth cannot be heated. It's an enemy that can't be beaten. He tapped the drawing, but it can be avoided. Raise the floor. Put air between the floor and the ground. Air doesn't conduct heat the way earth and stone do. 4 feet of air plus straw insulation reduces ground contact heat loss by 85 to 95%. We kept this cabin at 55 degrees with a fire that would have barely taken the edge off a ground-level cabin. Colton stared at the diagram, at the measurements written in an old woman's precise hand, at the Norwegian words scattered through the English text, at the simplicity of an idea that had been available to anyone who bothered to look. "We lost 3 people," he said quietly. "Ezekiel Tanner, Sarah Hutchkins, Robert Clemens." He paused. The silence filled with names that did not need to be spoken because they would never be forgotten. "They died because of floors I built," Colton continued. "Floors I built flat on the ground because that's how I was taught, and that's how I've always done it, and I never once questioned whether there might be a better way. Your grandmother drew a better way in a notebook, and I called it foolishness." Leander said nothing. There was nothing to say that would undo what the cold had done. "You offered to show me twice," Colton said. "I refused twice. Those refusals cost lives, Leander. I'll carry that until I die." "My grandmother carried the same weight," Leander said. "She knew how to build this. Her husband tore it down and she was too afraid to build another. She spent 30 years on a frozen floor because of fear. She wrote everything down so we wouldn't have to." Colton stayed for an hour. He drank tea. He examined every joint, every beam, every detail of the construction. He asked questions that Finn answered by reading passages from the notebook, translating Astrid's instructions into the language of a carpenter who was rebuilding his understanding of his own craft from the foundation up. When he left, he carried more than warmth back to the settlement. He carried the beginning of change. They came one by one over the following days. The men and women who had laughed, who had mocked, who had predicted failure and bet on collapse, and called the cabin every cruel name that small-town creativity could produce. Jedediah Caldwell came on January 18th. He climbed the ladder slowly, a man of considerable physical pride reduced to gripping each rung with hands that trembled from the effort of forcing himself into a space where he would have to confront something he had spent months denying. He spent 20 minutes inside the cabin. He examined the floor. He looked through the window at the crawl space below. He sat in the warmth and felt it hold steady without the roaring fire his own cabin demanded. He did not ask many questions. Caldwell was a man who understood things quickly when he finally allowed himself to see them. "I called you orphan boys playing house," he said at last, standing by the door, his hat in his hands. My daughter cried for 5 nights because I built her a home on the frozen ground. Your chicken legs kept you warm while my fine cabin nearly killed my family. He extended his hand. The gesture cost him more than Leander could know, more than anyone who has never been publicly wrong after being publicly certain can understand. I'm sorry, Caldwell said, for what I said about your grandmother, for what I said about you boys, for all of it. Leander shook the offered hand. Cold makes everyone foolish, he said, and the words were his grandmother's, pulled from a passage in the notebook that he had read so many times they had become his own. Wisdom comes to those who survive foolishness. You survived. Now you learn. Derek Skaggs came the same day, holding up his bandaged hand with his 2 missing fingers. I bet my best saddle your shack would fall, he said. I'd give every saddle I own to have built one like yours. His eyes were wet and not from the cold. Reverend Whitfield came last. He stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long time, his hands clasped in front of him, his face carrying the weight of a man who had invoked God's authority to condemn something God had apparently endorsed. I preached against raising yourself above God's earth, he said quietly. I said your grandmother's ways were prideful. Perhaps God put the wisdom in her hands, and I was too blind with my own pride to see it. I ask your forgiveness, and hers. Opal Pruitt came with food, enough to feed 20 people, in tears that she did not try to hide. I called you poor motherless things, she said. You're the richest people in this valley. You just didn't know it yet, and neither did we. Sometimes it takes losing everything to finally listen. Sometimes the people the world laughs at are the ones who end up saving it. If this story has meant something to you so far, I want you to know that the best part is still coming. Because what those 2 boys did next changed not just one valley, but an entire region. And it started with a grandmother's notebook and a pencil in an 11-year-old's hand. The spring of 1848 brought construction unlike anything Harrow Creek Valley had ever seen. Leander taught. It was what his grandmother had wanted, what the notebook had been designed to enable, and what the great cold had made not just possible but necessary. He taught on his porch, standing beside the posts that had survived the worst winter in recorded history. He taught with the notebook open, pointing to diagrams that Finn had copied onto larger sheets of paper so that groups of men could see them simultaneously. Finn became the draftsman, 11 years old, small for his age, quiet in the way he had always been quiet, but possessed of an ability to reproduce technical drawings with a precision that grown men found remarkable. He sat at a table on the porch and copied his grandmother's specifications onto sheet after sheet of paper, each one customized for the family that would use it, adjusted for the size of their planned cabin and the number of people it would shelter. Harlan Colton became the primary builder. His professional skill, once an obstacle, became the community's greatest asset. He translated Astrid's Norwegian methods into American construction practice, adapting her specifications to local materials and conditions while preserving the fundamental principle that made everything work. Raise the floor, separate the living space from the frozen ground, let air do what air does naturally, insulate. Gustav Lindmark finally stepped into the open. He forged hinges, brackets, and hardware for cabin after cabin, his Swedish heritage no longer something to hide, but something to honor. His grandmother's stabber in Dalarna, the structure he had mentioned once and then buried from public discussion, became a reference point that validated the Norwegian designs. 2 cultures, 2 traditions, the same wisdom. 7 families raised elevated cabins before the end of summer. 23 more were completed across the broader region by autumn, as word spread through neighboring settlements carried by men who had ridden to Harrow Creek to see the orphan Stilts for themselves and had climbed the ladder and felt the warmth and understood. The winter of 1848 to 49 brought another cold snap. Temperatures dropped to 25 below for 3 days in February. Enough to test, enough to prove. Families in elevated cabins maintained comfortable temperatures with modest fuel consumption. Families still in ground-level cabins struggled through nights of constant fire tending, burning twice the wood to achieve half the warmth. The contrast was visible in the smoke rising from chimneys across the valley, thin, quiet streams from the elevated cabins, heavy, desperate clouds from those still on the ground. More importantly, no one died. Not in Harrow Creek, not in the neighboring communities where elevated construction had spread. The knowledge that had saved 2 orphan boys had expanded to save hundreds of families. Regional building surveys conducted in 1852 documented the transformation. Of 156 cabins built in the Greater Settlement Area since 1848, 94 featured elevated construction with air gap insulation. Cold-related deaths in the surveyed region had dropped by 78% compared to pre-1848 averages. Firewood consumption per household had declined by approximately 40%, freeing labor for farming, education, and the thousand other activities that become possible when survival stops consuming every waking hour. Leander married Willa Whitmore in the spring of 1850. The wedding was held in the elevated cabin, the same cabin where Willa had stumbled through the door carrying a dying child on the coldest night in Wisconsin history. The same cabin where she had pressed her palm against the floor and felt the absence of death. Caldwell served as witness. His signature on the marriage certificate was a permanent record of how completely the Great Cold had changed the valley's social order. The man who had offered $40 for the land now stood in the cabin he had called the orphan Stilts, watching its builder marry a woman who had once lived in the small room behind her sister's kitchen, invisible to a community that measured people by what they owned rather than what they knew. Harlan Colton built them a proper staircase to replace the ladder. It was his wedding gift, the finest carpentry he had ever produced, each step carved from oak with joints so precise they would not creak for 50 years. He told Leander it was the least he could do. Both men knew it was not nearly enough, and both men knew it did not need to be. They raised 4 children in that cabin, 3 sons and a daughter, children who grew up taking warm floors for granted, who did not know and could not imagine that the space beneath their home, the ordinary, unremarkable air gap between floor and ground, represented a grandmother's lifetime of regret transformed into a legacy of survival. Finn grew tall eventually, though he was always lean, always quiet, always more comfortable with a pencil in his hand than with words in his mouth. He became an architect, not the kind with university degrees and offices in cities, but the practical kind, the kind that frontier communities needed, the kind that could look at a piece of land and see the building it required and draw it on paper with specifications so precise that any competent carpenter could follow them. He carried the notebook everywhere. It became part of him, the way a melody becomes part of a musician or a river becomes part of the land it crosses. When he designed buildings, the principles were always there. Air gaps, thermal breaks, separation from ground. The wisdom of a grandmother he had never met, transmitted through a book he had memorized so thoroughly he could have reproduced every page from memory. He took the technique west, to Minnesota, to the Dakotas, to every place where winter killed and floors froze and families suffered from the same ancient enemy that had claimed his mother and his grandmother and 3 people in Harrow Creek Valley whose names he never forgot. Copper lived to be 14 years old. He died on a September morning in 1861, lying on the porch of the elevated cabin in a patch of sunlight, his muzzle gray, his copper coat faded to the color of autumn leaves. Finn was with him. Finn had traveled back from Minnesota when Leander wrote to say the old dog was slowing down. He arrived 3 days before the end and spent those days sitting on the porch with Copper's head in his lap, scratching behind the ears that had once been alert to every sound on the trail. They buried him beneath the oak tree that Leander had planted the first spring on the property, a tree that by then stood 20 feet tall and shaded the cabin in summer. Finn carved a marker from a piece of the same oak. He found us when we had nothing. He stayed until we had everything. The whole family stood around the small grave, Leander and Willa and their 4 children, and Finn, who was 25 by then, but who cried like the 11-year-old boy who had crawled under a loading dock in Oconomowoc and found a starving dog and given it half of his last piece of bread. Leander Hargrove died in 1889 at the age of 60. The funeral was the largest in Harrow Creek's history. Men who had called him Stilt Boy in mockery called him Teacher in eulogy. Women who had pitied the poor motherless things named their sons and grandsons after him. Caldwell was there. He had outlived most of his contemporaries through the same iron will that had once made him the valley's greatest obstacle and later its most unlikely advocate. He stood at the grave and said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, it was not to the crowd but to the wooden marker that bore Leander's name. "You were right," he said, "about all of it, and I've spent 40 years being grateful that you were too kind to say I told you so. The elevated cabin stood until 1923, when Leander's grandson dismantled it to build a modern home with central heating. The massive posts, charred and buried 76 years earlier, showed no significant rot when they were pulled from the earth. The carbon layer had protected them exactly as Astrid Hargrove's notebook had specified, exactly as Norwegian builders had known it would for 800 years before anyone in Wisconsin had ever heard of a stabber. Local historians documented the structure before demolition. Photographs showed an ordinary-looking cabin, distinguished only by the 8 posts that held it above the ground. Posts that had become so overgrown with climbing roses that visitors sometimes did not notice them at all. The most revolutionary feature of the building was, in the end, invisible. An empty space. 4 feet of nothing. The absence that saved everything. Modern building science research conducted by the University of Wisconsin in 1987 confirmed the thermal principles underlying the Hargrove construction. Studies documented that frozen ground in Wisconsin winters conducts heat away from ground contact structures at rates exceeding 15 BTU per square foot per hour, a constant drain that requires substantial fuel input to overcome. Elevated structures with proper air gaps reduce this ground contact heat loss by 85 to 95%, depending on insulation quality. The 4-foot elevation that Astrid Hargrove specified in her notebook provides optimal separation from frost heave effects while maintaining practical access height. The straw insulation in the crawl space, while primitive by modern standards, creates a trapped air barrier with thermal resistance comparable to 2 inches of modern fiberglass insulation. Contemporary passive house design employs thermal break principles, identical to those Astrid Hargrove documented in 1847. Modern engineers call it thermal bridging prevention. They publish papers about it in journals with long names and peer review processes. They present findings at conferences in cities where winter is an inconvenience rather than a killer. Astrid called it not dying. The notebook itself resides in the Dane County Historical Society Museum, displayed in a glass case beside a photograph of the original cabin and a brass plaque that reads, Hargrove Building Method, circa 1847, Norwegian-American construction technique for elevated cold climate housing, developed by Astrid Hargrove, née Solvang, and built by her grandsons, Leander and Phineas Hargrove. Developed by Astrid Hargrove, a woman who never built the thing she designed, whose husband tore down her first attempt and whose fear prevented a second, who spent 30 years sleeping on a frozen floor, knowing exactly how to fix it, too afraid to try again. But she wrote it down. Every measurement, every principle, every lesson the cold had taught her across a lifetime of winters that Americans could not imagine. She wrote it all in a leather-bound notebook and left it to 2 grandsons she barely knew, trusting that boys with nothing to lose might have the courage she believed she lacked. She was right about the building. She was right about the cold. She was right about the ground and the air and the 4 feet of nothing that could save everything. But she was wrong about one thing. She called herself a coward. She believed that her failure to rebuild the stabber was weakness, that her fear had won, that she had let the cold defeat her. She was wrong. A coward does not spend 30 years documenting knowledge that could save lives. A coward does not fill 87 pages with precise drawings and careful calculations. A coward does not write a letter to grandchildren she may never meet, pouring into words the courage she believed she could not put into timber and nails. A coward does not leave behind a blueprint for survival and trust that someone, someday, will be brave enough to build it. Astrid Hargrove was not a coward. She was a woman who found a different way to build, not with posts and platforms and charred timber, but with ink and paper and the fierce, unbreakable hope that knowledge, William knowledge, once written down, cannot be torn down the way a building can. Her husband could destroy her stabber. He could not destroy her notebook. And the notebook outlasted them both. If you've watched this far, you already know what this story is really about. It's not about cabins or construction or even survival. It's about the things we inherit from the people who loved us, the knowledge they fought to preserve, the courage they gave us when they thought they had none left for themselves. Astrid Hargrove never built her stabber, but her grandsons built it for her, and the home she never raised saved a valley. If someone in your life left you something, a recipe, a lesson, a way of doing things that the world called old-fashioned or foolish or foreign. Hold on to it. You never know when the cold is coming, and you never know when that old wisdom might be the only thing standing between you and the frozen ground. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one. Somewhere in whatever quiet place Norwegian grandmothers rest, a woman who died on a frozen floor finally felt warm. Not from fire, not from straw or timber or the engineering of air gaps and thermal breaks. From the knowledge that her words had reached the right hands at the right time, that two boys with nothing had built everything she dreamed, that the ground had come hungry, as it always does, and for the first time in the history of her family, it had starved. The hut on chicken legs was not magic. It was not foreign. It was not foolish. It was love, written in measurements, built in silence, and proven in the coldest winter anyone could remember by two orphan boys, a copper-colored doing, and a grandmother's notebook that refused to let the cold win.